Delightful to be with you again this month and for the One Life sessions. It's a wonderful, hopefully a long tradition, but it's a wonderful series. So you're in for a real treat tonight. I'm delighted, I really am delighted to introduce Dr. Heather Lloyd to you, and I cannot think of someone better to engage this conversation with us. Dr. Lloyd's research interests relate to two basic elements of the human experience, and that's sex and food. So she has a background in biological psychology, and particularly she's interested in the biopsychology of human sexuality and how it relates to the whole person in context. So I think this is a really helpful lens for us. The topics between her topics of sexuality and food are linked by her interest in emotions, and particularly and especially disgust, and also in moral judgment. So that's how we get to our topic tonight of empathy. She's worked at these conversations in both academic and church settings. And so actually I had, I don't know if she remembers, I was even a part of this conversation, but one of Dr. Lloyd is a respected educator and thoughtful educator in our community, and the Catholic community here in Edmonton asked Dr. Lloyd to come alongside this same conversation. So the Catholic and Christian school systems are part of the Edmonton public school system. And so when the requirement came for safe spaces for LGBT students and how to navigate that with parents and kids in the school system, Dr. Looy was one of the people that helped them navigate that conversation. So I know her to be someone who's really thoughtful and sensitive to the issues that are in the room, as well as highly engaged in these conversations in her classroom, in her community. Dr. Lloyd grew up in the CRC. She has roots in the CRC, the Presbyterian and Baptist churches. So she's well prepared to speak about how to engage this across the faith dialogues. She is also really engaged in conversations between science and religion. And so I think we'll bring some really interesting things for us to digest tonight and give us an opportunity to engage a conversation perhaps in a different direction than we have engaged with it before. So with that, it's my delight to turn it over to Dr. Lloyd.
That's my cue, I take it. Thank you, Dr. Humphreys, so much for that. And whoa, you set the bar high. And the opening piece that the One Life group, that litany that you read, I feel like, okay, well, now you said what I'm going to say, so we can just all talk together for the rest of the evening. But I will say what I prepared to say. So I'm going to share my screen. And hang on, if I click the right button, I will share my screen. So this is the title of the talk, and we are going to talk about this. But what I want to do first to start out is to step back and to look at a couple of important callings that that we have as Christians. And those callings, at least one of them has been mentioned repeatedly in the opening to this talk this evening. And those are the callings of hospitality and holiness. This beautiful icon by Rublev shows God, the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, in hospitality with one another. And so it kind of captures in God the perfected coming together of holiness and hospitality. But this is God, and we are humans. And holiness and hospitality are a little more challenging for us. So while this might not sound very much like the title of the talk, we are going to get there. So I hope you can bear with me as we go here. So hospitality, which isn't entirely synonymous with these other words, but is strongly associated with these other words, mercy, love, and grace, is clearly in the One Life curriculum, if you will, is a central notion and something that you've probably been engaged with already. So I'm going to just very briefly remind you of the calling to hospitality that we see in Scripture. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Or this one, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And then in this passage in Luke where Jesus asks his questioner, what is the greatest commandment? And the answer is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then when Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we're going to see again toward the end of this talk. The central message being that your neighbor is other human beings, full stop. Holiness, its root in Hebrew has to do with purity, this idea of purifying. And synonyms for holiness are words like sanctity and righteousness and the idea of being set apart. And this too is a calling. Just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. And see the connection of holiness and purity here, which is going to be pretty central in tonight's talk. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy and have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Now, there is a lot that has been and can be said about both hospitality and holiness. In this talk, I want to focus much more narrowly on the psychological dynamics that are involved, especially with holiness, dynamics that contribute to a tension between hospitality and holiness, and particularly when it comes to questions around sexuality and gender. But before we get into the psychological bits of this conversation, what I'd like to ask you to do is to take just a few minutes to do some self-reflection, because after all, I'm a psychologist, I've got to ask you to do this. So I'm going to show you 3 slides of images. And what I'd like you to do is to tell me your emotional reaction to each of the images. And so for each image, I actually have a poll. So I'm going to show you the image. I'm going to put up the poll. It's multiple choice. It's completely anonymous. And what I'd really like you to do, and I'm going to go through these really quickly because I don't want you to think about your response. I don't want you to tell me what you think you ought to feel or how you think you ought to react to the images. I just want you to choose the option that's sort of your immediate gut reaction to the images. And then with each one, we'll look at the responses that we get from the community here, but remember, it's all completely anonymous. So I have no idea what your responses are going to be, but let's just give this a try. So here's the first image. And here's the first poll. And I'm going to close the poll in just a few seconds here. So if there's anybody who's wanting to give their reaction last minute, this is your last chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. And so here's the results of the poll. I hope you can all see this. So the vast majority of the responses to this image are pleasure, delight. That's your first reaction. Another really common reaction is, calm, gentle positivity, some neutral, and one person feeling slightly negative or uncomfortable with this image. And that's not too surprising. Okay, so next image and similar question. Whoops, I need to get the other poll up. Where is my other poll? Ashley, how do I get my other poll?
I'm looking, yes.
Thank you. Okay, and we're about at the same percentage voting as before, so I'm going to call it and close it and share the results. And you'll notice that there's a bigger range now of responses among all of us to these images on this screen. Everything from pleasure and delight to some strongly negative reactions and everything in between. Now remember, this isn't about right or wrong answers. This is just about what is your gut reaction. Okay, one last image for you. Ashley, can you launch the last poll? Because I seem to not know how to do it. Thank you. Okay, it looks like we're winding down here, so I'm going to end this poll. And here we go. So again, a range of reactions. Not very much pleasure and delight. A lot more kind of in the middle, leaning toward the negative with this particular image in terms of reactions. So just notice how you responded to these images and carry that with you as we talk about the role of emotions in our responses to difference. So, as you saw with the images, the first one was something that's probably pretty familiar to most of us, fairly comfortable, probably for most of us fits what we grew up believing the world was like, how things work or how they should work, and then move to things that were increasingly less familiar, possibly even things that are in violation of some of the values or beliefs or practices that you grew up with, perhaps even values, beliefs, and practices that you currently embrace. And that, of course, was deliberate. There is a point here. Now, I asked you about your emotional reaction. And emotions are psychologically important. They tell us what is important. If you don't react emotionally to something, then that's a sign that it probably doesn't matter that much. But as our emotional reactions get stronger, that's a sign to our minds, to our spirits, to our bodies. This matters. Remember this. Pay attention to this. And then the flavor of our emotions tell us whether this is something that we should approach or avoid, embrace, or reject. It's not the only thing that tells us that, but emotions play a really significant role in that process. Now, we're talking about holiness here. And psychologically, the emotion associated with holiness is the emotion of disgust. Now, that might seem kind of contradictory because holiness, we think of something that's sort of pure and good, and disgust doesn't feel like that. But I'm going to explain to you how disgust is involved in this story. And it's involved in the story in ways that are potentially deeply problematic, particularly in the context of sexuality. Now, before we get into how it's problematic and how it applies to sexuality in particular, I want to take you through a very, very brief tour through the emotion of disgust and the things that it does for us, because I think it's important to recognize its role and how it functions in order for us to become aware of the ways in which it could be problematic or dangerous. So disgust is a basic human emotion, and it serves a number of important functions. These images illustrate this really wide range of things that disgust is applied to, from tastes and smells that warn us that we shouldn't ingest something, we shouldn't allow it to cross the boundary of our physical self because it's a threat, it's a danger, to reminders of our mortality, things that tell us that we are physical, that we are embodied, that we came from dust, and to dust we shall return, that remind us of our frailty. So signs of disease, signs of death, and so on, all the way to what we call the socio-moral domain of disgust, which is it's a revulsion towards things like social difference, violation of social norms or rules or morals. And this last function of disgust is important in protecting our social identities. It helps preserve the integrity of our communities, and it keeps us within certain moral boundaries. So disgust applies to a really wide range of phenomena. And some scholars refer to it as a promiscuous emotion because of that. So this is where disgust happens. But then what does disgust do for us? Well, the key thing that it does is it creates and defends boundaries. That is its main function. It protects us from physical or social threats by keeping them outside of the boundaries we set, the boundaries of our physical body, the boundaries of our individual identity, and the boundaries of our social communities. The other thing that disgust does is to motivate us to action. All of our emotions motivate us in some way or another. Disgust, the actions that disgust motivates fall on this continuum, from withdrawal to active elimination and everything in between. We can see that in the facial expression that's classically associated with disgust. If you have a strong disgust reaction, you feel it in the nausea that you might experience. Even with really strong disgust, you might actually throw up. And so maybe you can already start to see some of the problems with this emotion, that it motivates us to withdraw, to avoid, to reject, to expel, even to eliminate things that we perceive as threats, not just to our physical well-being, but also to our psychological or social identity. Disgust also comes along with this notion of contamination. And here we're going to start to see this connection to purity and ultimately then to holiness. So anything that we find disgusting, if it crosses the boundary and makes contact with us or with something that we want to interact with or embrace, then it contaminates that thing. Now the thing it touched or came into contact with has become itself disgusting. The classic waiter, there's a fly in my soup illustrates this at a really basic level. A fly lands in your soup and contaminates it. Of course, that fly might actually be carrying contaminants that you shouldn't ingest because it might be a physical threat to you. But the psychology of disgust and the range of things that trigger disgust means that whatever we perceive as outside our boundaries and a potential physical or psychological threat to us has the power to contaminate. Now, this is such an important and powerful concept that I want to say a few more things about it. There's 4 basic principles of contamination. One is that actual or even figurative contact causes contamination. If you looked at the previous image closely, you might have noticed that the fly in the soup was actually plastic. It wasn't a real fly. And yet you would be surprised how many people, and researchers have demonstrated this repeatedly, how many people will still refuse to eat the soup, even though it's demonstrated to them. It's a plastic fly. It's not a real fly. It's a sterilized plastic fly. There's no way that it could actually physically hurt you. And yet their disgust response is such that they still can't bring themselves to eat the soup. So the contact doesn't have to be actual. It can be figurative. Contamination is kind of all or nothing. Even a microscopic amount of contact is harmful. It renders you defiled or unclean. It's also really difficult to purify something that has been contaminated. In cultural or religious contexts where the concept of purity is significant, there often are various rituals that you can undergo to restore yourself to a state of cleanliness or purity. But the ritual processes are usually moderately complex and significant. And psychologically, they don't always completely erase the lingering flavor of the contamination. And the 4th thing I wanted to say about contamination is that when the disgusting and the pure come into contact, the pure is always contaminated. It's never the other way around. We never talk about sort of positive contamination. Contamination is, to us, by definition, a bad thing. This quote by 2 psychologists who've done quite a bit of research into disgust illustrates this fairly well. A teaspoon of sewage will spoil a barrel of wine, but a teaspoon of wine will do nothing for a barrel of sewage. The last thing I want to say about disgust in general is that it's learned. Kids are gross, this image says. They are. So any of you have spent any time around young children, you know that they do not find the same things disgusting. They don't find anything disgusting. They will put dead flies in their mouth. They will put that piece of gum they found stuck under the church pew in their mouth and chew it. They think their own feces are fascinating, not disgusting. And when they're getting toilet trained, they're often quite proudly bringing them to you in the living room while you're visiting with your friends to show you what they've done. This is a developmental process. We have to learn to be disgusted, and we're taught what to find disgusting. And some of that teaching is critically important to our physical survival. And it's also critically important to navigating our social world. But it isn't until around the age of 4 or 5 that kids even, start to have full-blown disgust responses to the range of things that adults find disgusting. And even at that age, they're still learning. And throughout your life, you can learn to develop disgusts to various stimuli or actions or behaviors that previously you might have found okay. And for example, researchers have found that people who choose to become vegetarian for moral reasons find themselves often getting to the point where even the sight or smell of meat makes them feel like they want to throw up. Even if prior to that decision to become a vegetarian, they quite liked it. They quite liked meat products. Now, because disgust is learned, it means that the things we find disgusting reflect the values, beliefs, practices, and priorities of our community. And that's an important point I hope you bear in mind as we move through the rest of this. So, disgust preserves purity by policing the boundaries that protect us from contamination. And remember, holiness is intimately connected to the concept of purity. The purity metaphor is significant in Christianity. For example, the Israelites were called to be a distinctive community, and the law helped them to guard and teach and live out that distinctiveness. And in those laws, there's a lot of emphasis on the boundary between clean and unclean. And you hear, when you read the law, you will hear lots of terms like defiled, abomination, abhorrence, and purification. And even if you're not, a Hebrew or a Jew, but you're a modern Christian, you will have heard of sin as a state of impurity, something from which we need to be washed clean. Now, while the purity metaphor is associated broadly with holiness and sin in Christianity, it is particularly involved with sexuality. There's something special about sexuality. It's not entirely clear why, but there is something special about it. So, first of all, this is not going to sound relevant, but hopefully I'll make it relevant in just a second. Social categories are psychologically important. They simplify complexity, they create boundaries, they tell us what to expect and how to respond. And so we need categories psychologically. We live in an incredibly complex world, not just physically, but socially. And categories help us to simplify that complexity and to put things in boundaries, to put things in boxes so that we can figure out how to navigate. We don't have to treat everything as completely new. Now, sex and gender are particularly significant categories. They're taught early and they're defended strongly. So these are categories that are sort of strongly drawn, and we're taught very, very young that they're really important. So we have these categories around sex and gender, around sexuality that have very strong boundaries. And the purity metaphor is particularly connected to sexuality in Christian circles. In fact, in some Christian circles, these two terms are almost synonymous. That is, I know in my teenage years when I was in the Baptist church, whenever we would, in our youth group, our leaders would say, we're going to have a conversation about purity. We all knew that was code for we're going to talk about sex. And that was just understood that the word purity in Christian circles was a reference to sex, to sexual behavior, to sexual desires, to sexual expression. Now, there are many, many types of sin, sexual sins and other types of sins, but sexual sins generate a sense of loathing, of disgust, that sins like excessive shopping just don't seem to evoke. This is a quote from Richard Beck, who's a Christian psychologist who's done some really important work on this topic that I'm sharing with you this evening. And he's right. There's something about sexual sins and this concept of disgust and purity that is powerfully connected. We use other metaphors as lenses to talk about other kinds of sins, metaphors like falling or betrayal. But they don't carry with them the same kind of psychological baggage as sexual sins and the notion of purity and how disgust can help us defend and maintain the boundaries to stay sexually pure. So we use the lens of purity a lot when we talk about sexuality. So why is any of this a problem? Well, it's a problem because purity and holiness metaphors divide the world into clean and unclean, us and them. That's what they do. The Israelites were a nation set apart. They were different from the other nations. They were to keep themselves completely separate. That was a really important concept. You see it all over the place in the Hebrew scriptures. But as Richard Beck points out, these metaphors then are a recipe for conflict and division. Now, the boundaries between clean and unclean, us and them, are psychologically supported in part by the emotion of disgust. And disgust leads us to view the disgusting object or act or person as a threat, less than human, something to reject or eliminate. As Richard Beck says, disgust is inherently dehumanizing. Now, I'm taking some big leaps in the argument here for the sake of time. There's more nuanced steps along the way here. So if some of you are going, I'm not quite sure I follow the logic here, I get that. I've sent some resources to Liz Tolkamp, who can send them out to you if you want to explore this in more detail later. I do want to say, though, again, quoting Richard Beck, that this is not to say that purity and holiness categories are wrong, that we should get rid of them. Only that the psychology they activate is socially and morally dangerous and difficult to tame. So if there's one thing you remember about tonight's talk, I hope that it's this, that the psychology that purity and holiness activates is socially and morally dangerous and difficult to tame. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's a challenge. So I want to show you how disgust psychology and topics around sexual diversity interact with each other. And so I'm just going to give you a few examples. First of all, research shows that even people who want to accept sexual or gender diversity, people who say, I want to embrace all people in, all their identities and expressions, and welcome them to the table. Even those individuals experience disgust at identities and practices that don't fit within their own familiar boundaries. I know that's even true. That's true for myself. I've been studying this and exploring this for decades now, and I still, if I see a picture of, say, two men kissing, and I'll show you one in just a minute, it doesn't do a lot for me. In fact, it's not just neutral, it sort of feels a little, I don't know, that doesn't sit comfortably in my gut. The question is, what am I going to do about that reaction? I need to know that I'm having it. Also, this is a really concerning point. People who perceive their own sexual or gender identities or desires as sinful turn the disgust inward, experiencing self-loathing and shame. So if you are part of a community that has told you, what the clear boundary, your community says, here are the clear boundaries around sexuality, around gender, and you discover that you actually are outside of those boundaries, what do? This makes people who identify as sexual or gender minorities particularly vulnerable, because self-loathing and shame are psychologically profoundly damaging, and they're very difficult to heal. So this is, the connection between disgust and sexual boundaries is not trivial, especially for people who perceive themselves as outside the boundaries of the very communities that they want to be part of. And disgust psychology is explicitly leveraged to persuade others to reject various boundary crossing policies or practices, and it's leveraged because it works. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. Here's that picture that I mentioned I was going to show you, and here's one response to it. Your publishing of a photograph of two homosexual men kissing will show to Americans how disgusting and repulsive homosexuality is. Proponents of anti-gay legislation have regularly and continue regularly to put out information that is intended deliberately to trigger your disgust at people who are sexual and gender minorities. They send out information that suggests things like that gay men eat feces or drink human blood. I mean, it's untrue, but this is leveraging disgust, which is a sort of so naturally connected to sexuality, in a way that's used to persuade people. I'm going to read you a quote. This is an extreme position, and so I hope it. In a way, I kind of hope it troubles you to hear it, but it's, while it's extreme, a quieter, more subtle version of this is really quite widespread. And this is a quote from somebody called Brian Fisher, who was a pastor. He now has a radio show in the United States. And he says these things: homosexuality is an abomination because it causes an inner revulsion. In other words, when you see it, you think about it, you recoil from it. Your instinct is to recoil from it in some kind of disgust. He goes on, homosexual behavior is an abomination to God. When God sees it, it causes him to recoil. People's natural reaction is that it's just not normal. That's just not natural. That's not what human beings were designed for. That's not what they were made for. Now, while that's really strong language, notice here what he's doing. He's assuming that disgust is this natural, inborn, God-given response that reliably tells us when something's wrong. And this is just not true. Remember, I told you, disgust is learned. We learn what to find disgusting. It's not, we don't feel disgust because something is inherently unnatural. We feel disgust because we've been told that something is unnatural or is wrong or is to be avoided. So it is not a reliable guide to morality or to holiness. Now, this concern about the use of disgust is something that has been raised by a number of legal scholars as well, because these arguments have moved into the courtroom. This editorial cartoon illustrates an example of this. What do you mean it's icky isn't a legitimate legal basis for banning gay marriage? And there's also a defense. It's sometimes called the disgust defense and sometimes the moral panic defense that is being brought into courtrooms when people are being tried because they have assaulted or murdered somebody they perceived to be homosexual or transgender or in some other way offensive to them because of their sexual or gender difference. It's been used in other contexts as well, but it's in this context that it is most commonly being used. And the argument is this, that although you shouldn't assault or murder other people under any circumstances, it's kind of justifiable if you perceive them as homosexual or transgender or something like that, because it's so disgusting. And the natural response when you feel disgust is to, is to eliminate that thing because it's a threat to you. You perceive it as a threat to your identity or your values or your community or your nation. And so, so this defense is brought into courtrooms to argue not that the person didn't do it, but that they were justified in doing it because of their disgust response. Now, it doesn't work very often in the courtroom, but it does work sometimes. And usually the way it works is to kind of reduce the length of somebody's sentence because of this sense that, well, the ordinary person on the street could be justified in finding that repulsive enough that they might be strongly motivated to do something about it. Yeah, you shouldn't have actually attacked the person, but we kind of get why you did. So disgust psychology has some problems. It leads to some problematic reasoning. Further, it puts holiness and hospitality into conflict. Disgust conflicts with empathy. I know at the beginning when you were talking about this talk, you talked a lot about how I'm going to focus on empathy. And we're getting there, but actually I'm not really focusing on empathy. I'm focusing on the things that get in the way of empathy. And a further exploration of empathy is going to require another conversation. Okay, so I got to move a little faster here because I'm running out of time. Disgust creates boundaries. Empathy crosses them, right? Disgust is about boundaries. Empathy is about crossing boundaries, seeing yourself in the other, walking across that boundary to act compassionately towards them. And research shows that empathic responses are greatly reduced when we perceive the other person as outside of our social boundaries. And these empathic responses that are reduced, we see that in brain activity. So the neural circuits associated with empathy, the activity is reduced. We see it in people's subjective responses, the degree of empathy that they report feeling for that individual, and we see it in their behavior. What this means is that psychologically, you cannot love the sinner and hate the sin. When I first heard this phrase, I thought, oh, that kind of works. It's sort of logical. I can get my head around that. But it turns out that this is actually very, very difficult to do psychologically. Moral outrage and empathy are not good bedfellows. You can't experience both at the same time. So especially when the sin or the perceived sin is sexual in nature, because it's triggering disgust, and disgust is about boundaries. You need to stay away from that thing or that person when you experience disgust. But loving the sinner means experiencing and acting on empathy, which means overcoming your disgust. And that's really hard to do. So how do we avoid the problems that disgust psychology presents and practice empathy and hospitality and also be holy? Well, fortunately, we've got lots of guides to do this in scripture. And I'm going to give you 4 ways in which Jesus flips the script on the story of disgust. First of all, he teaches us not to dehumanize the other in the name of purity. This painting illustrates Jesus is eating with some Pharisees, and the woman comes in who pours the expensive ointment on his feet and so on. And the Pharisees are sitting there going, well, Jesus knew who was touching him. He would be, he would recognize what an offense this is, how he has now been rendered unclean. This is bad. This is, she's crossed these boundaries. This is inappropriate. And Jesus knows what they're thinking. And he challenges them and he tells them a parable. And at the end of the parable, he says, do you see this woman? Which is a very weird thing for him to say, because of course they see this woman. She's in the room. She's the point of the conversation. They're looking at her. But Jesus says, this is not about an abstract issue. This is not about your laws and your figuring out, theological correctness here. She's a human being and she's in this room, and you want to argue theology? You don't get to dehumanize her. Do you see this woman? He also demonstrates that rule about contamination that I told you earlier, it actually can be flipped. At least Jesus can flip it. And so in his case, impurity can be decontaminated. This is the woman that's in this image, is a woman who's bleeding for 12 years. And by bleeding, she is ritually unclean. She doesn't get to participate in the daily life of her community. She's deeply isolated. This is devastating for her. And she's desperate. And she hears about this healer and she wants to be healed, but she doesn't even dare ask. She doesn't dare show her face. And so she scuttles through the crowd and she grabs his robe, and Jesus stops. And he doesn't say, woman, how dare you touch me? You've defiled me. Now I have to go do some purity ritual before I can go on with my ministry. He doesn't do that at all. He turns around and says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Her bleeding stops. She is literally now clean because she contacted the purity of Christ. Third point, God calls us to cross these boundaries. So the early church quickly encountered a problem because non-Jews were also interested in the gospel. And were these others who wanted to join this new community, this body of Christ, were they going to have to conform to all the rules and practices of the Jews who became the first Christians? Did they have to get circumcised? Did they have to change their dietary habits? And so they're having this huge debates about this, who's in and who's out, and what do you have to do, and what do you have to fulfill to be in, to be welcome? And then Peter is given this vision of the sheet with all the foods, all the animals that the Jews weren't allowed to eat, that were unclean. And God says, Peter, eat these. God says it 3 times, and Peter goes, I can't eat that stuff. I'm a good Jew. I'm righteous. I'm holy. I'm pure. I know where the boundaries are. And God says, no, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. And finally, Jesus says that purity is not about boundaries protecting us from external threats. It's about the desires and directions of our hearts. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them, he says. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. He thinks this is such an important point that in this passage in Mark, he actually repeats this point 4 times. So the message that I take from all of this is that holiness is achieved through hospitality. The parable of the Good Samaritan reminds us of that. The Jews and the Samaritans lived in totally different social communities. The boundaries between them were really strong. The Jews for sure were not interacting with the Samaritans. That would be offensive. That would make them unclean. It would make them impure. And here's this Jew that gets beaten up and left on the side of the road, and the Samaritan says, to heck with the boundaries, I'm helping you. And Jesus says, yeah, you do that. You do that thing. You step across those social boundaries, because those social boundaries don't count in the body of Christ. You can't be holy before God if you do not also love your neighbor. And remember the question, who is my neighbor? All the people, full stop. And I'm going to stop right there, which is probably going to feel like I'm leaving you hanging in midair. But what I want to do is to leave you with some food for thought so that you can draw your own conclusions about what this might mean for conversations about our communities, living faithfully, forming ourselves faithfully, and engaging difference, engaging diversity, and especially engaging sexual and gender diversity.